The executive, disguised, stepped into the upscale restaurant and ordered a steak. The waitress slipped him a small folded note that rendered him speechless. What would happen if the powerful CEO of a renowned restaurant empire suddenly realized he'd been utterly blind to the crushing pressure his staff endured every single day, until a secret letter laid bare a heartbreaking truth and turned his world upside down? Jack Reynolds stood in the expansive dressing room of his lavish penthouse, his gaze fixed on the large mirror hanging before him. Staring back was a complete stranger, not the celebrated CEO praised by the press, nor the impeccably tailored figure in expensive suits and polished leather shoes. Instead, reflected there was a middle-aged man in faded jeans, a plain button, down shirt, and scuffed dress shoes that bore the marks of a hard life. This was not the first time Jack had felt uneasy, but perhaps the first time he'd consciously manufactured that unease himself. For years, he'd flourished beneath the dazzling spotlight of fame and success, accustomed to total control over every aspect of his world. Yet now, as he stood on the brink of the boldest decision of his career, he felt more anxious and uncertain than ever before. It began 3 days ago, when he stumbled across scathing, anguished reviews on a secret internal forum, raw accounts from his own employees. Their harsh words and sorrowful stories haunted him, robbing him of sleep night after night. He had always been proud of Brooks Steakhouse, the luxury dining chain he'd built from scratch into an American icon. And yet, now it was his own staff who were exposing a workplace rife with pressure, disrespect, and even discrimination. Jack could not accept this. At first, he planned to convene an emergency meeting with his senior managers to get to the bottom of it. But a nagging intuition warned that he would never uncover the real truth unless he walked a mile in their shoes. That's why he decided to go undercover, an unprecedented move for someone of his stature. He approached the vanity table and ran his fingers through his normally pristine, dark brown hair, ruffling it just enough to strip away its polished sheen. He deliberately set aside his Rolex, the luxury emblem of his power and achievement, and replaced it with a plain, anonymous timepiece he'd snagged at a neighborhood dollar store. Each element of his new look had been carefully curated: a common man's wardrobe, a humble watch, every detail designed to render him invisible, just another face in the crowd. His eyes drifted to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Chicago's glittering skyline. Below, the very first Brooks Steakhouse, ground zero for his storied ascent, beckoned. He'd chosen this location intentionally. If problems existed, he knew they'd be most acute at the restaurant that had launched his empire. Silently, he slipped out of his apartment and boarded the familiar high-end elevator, not as a confident CEO but as an anxious stranger. When the doors opened at the underground garage, he bypassed his sleek Mercedes-Benz and instead headed for a dusty Honda Civic he'd bought on a whim just yesterday. The plan was simple: disappear among ordinary diners. Settling into the worn driver's seat, Jack exhaled, the mixture of thrill and trepidation coursing through him. As he turned the ignition, the Civic's rattling engine seemed to whisper promises of an unpredictable adventure. He merged into the bustling nighttime traffic, Chicago's neon glow a blur around him. On the drive, his mind raced with questions. Were the allegations truly as dire as the employees claimed? Could he remain composed when confronted with the harsh realities he'd long ignored? Was Brooks Steakhouse really just a facade of perfection, masking stifling pressure, and perhaps even racial bias that he had never imagined? The questions circled endlessly, but one thing was certain: he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. No matter the outcome, he would not shrink from the truth. Jack Reynolds, the most powerful CEO in the restaurant world, was about to learn what it felt like to walk in someone else's shoes. The Civic eased onto the familiar street. Ahead, the neon sign of Brooks Steakhouse blazed defiantly, a stark reminder that from this moment on there was no turning back. Jack drew in a deep breath, his resolve hardening. Tonight, he was not Jack Reynolds, the illustrious CEO. Tonight he was simply Michael Anderson, an ordinary patron seeking answers in the very dining room he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. And what he discovered next might be far more brutal than anything he'd ever dared to imagine. Jack stepped through the doors of Brooks Steakhouse, the very place where his storied career began, and felt the same thrill he'd had on opening night all those years ago. On the surface, everything was flawless. Warm, golden light poured down from the high ceilings. Rich mahogany, paneled walls spoke of understated luxury. Soft jazz floated through the air, lending an elegant, upscale ambiance. This was the refined haven Jack had proudly built over the years, the one every guest entered knowing they'd experience nothing less than perfection. But today, under the guise of an anonymous diner, Jack sensed something was off from the very first moments. He swept his eyes over the staff, those who ought to be the restaurant's heartbeat and soul. Instead of genuine smiles and eager enthusiasm, he saw mechanical grins, anxious eyes, and fleeting shadows of exhaustion, all carefully concealed behind practiced facades. "Right this way, sir," the young hostess greeted him politely, leading him to a table tucked into the far corner. Her name tag read Sarah. Impeccably dressed, she offered a stage, trained smile. Yet Jack noticed it never reached her deep blue eyes, which carried a weary tension as though the slightest misstep could earn her a sharp reprimand. "Would you care for something to drink first?" Sarah asked, sliding the menu toward him. "Just water, please, thank you," Jack replied, feigning absorption in his phone to better survey the room. He glanced around. Not far from his table, a young black waitress stood silently as a well-dressed, middle-aged customer launched into a harsh complaint. He jabbed at the steak on his plate. "Don't you understand English? I clearly said medium, rare, not this near raw nonsense." Head bowed, the waitress murmured an apology, though Jack could see the steak had been cooked perfectly to order. He frowned as the man's volume rose nearly to a shout, drawing curious looks from fellow diners. "I don't know how you hire people like her to serve your customers," the guest sneered. A subtle hint of prejudice Jack recognized instantly. His blood warmed with anger, but he forced himself to watch how management and staff would react. Jack spotted restaurant manager Brandon Evans, someone Jack himself had hired just a few years back, hustle over with a disingenuous grin. Instead of defending the young waitress, he waved her away with a cold glance, as though she were the problem. In that moment, Jack saw the injustice lurking beneath the veneer of professionalism and prestige. In this opulent eatery, perfection was prized above all, even at the cost of fairness and respect. He continued to watch the other servers as they moved through their routines with robotic precision. He saw no spark of joy in anyone's work. Their eyes darted constantly toward the kitchen door and the ticking clock overhead, as if an invisible pressure weighed on their shoulders. When the waitress who'd been berated returned to his table, he caught her name badge. Amelia. Her simple name belied the sorrow in her eyes. As she hurried past to refill another guest's napkins, Jack noticed fresh burn scars on her hands, surely the result of long hours and harsh conditions. At that moment, Brandon swept by Jack's table, phone pressed to his ear, voice flat and unfeeling. "If she gets another complaint, cut her next week's shifts immediately. We don't need this kind of trouble here." The manager's ruthless words stabbed Jack's heart. He'd never imagined someone he'd trusted could so callously discard an employee's dignity. especially when Amelia had done nothing wrong. Jack forced a neutral expression, though his mind was racing. He realized he'd profoundly misjudged the very people and workplace he'd devoted his life to building. Around him, the dinner service carried on. Elegant patrons enjoying fine food and polished service. But Jack could no longer taste the luxury. A darker truth had revealed itself. This celebrated restaurant wasn't only about exquisite cuisine and top-tier hospitality. It was also a breeding ground for relentless pressure, injustice, and unspoken racial bias. And Jack knew this was only the tip of the iceberg. What he'd witnessed so far was but a glimpse of the painful reality waiting for him deeper inside. Jack cast a quick glance around, keeping the calm facade of an ordinary diner, but inside his mind everything was in upheaval. The scenes he'd just witnessed, especially the way manager Brandon had coldly handled the situation, left him feeling deeply unsettled and remorseful. It was the first time Jack had seen clearly an issue he'd never considered before. Racism had quietly taken root in the restaurant chain he'd always taken pride in, like a poisonous weed hidden beneath a glossy surface. Just then, a soft female voice beside him brought him back to the moment. "Good evening, sir. I'm Amelia, and I'll be serving you tonight. Are you ready to order, or would you like a few more minutes?" Jack looked up and really saw her for the first time. Amelia had smooth, warm brown skin, deep brown eyes, and long, graceful lashes. But those eyes that ought to have radiated vitality, reflected an exhaustion no practiced smile could conceal. He immediately remembered how that demanding customer had berated her minutes ago, and how Brandon had handled it with such ruthless indifference. "Could you recommend your signature dish?" Jack asked, striving for a friendly tone, a silent apology for what she'd endured. Amelia straightened her posture and forced a professional smile. "Yes, sir. Our house specialty is the 28-day dry-aged ribeye, served with a red wine reduction, grilled asparagus, and garlic mashed potatoes. It's our most popular entree." Jack nodded, pretending to study the menu to prolong the conversation. "That sounds perfect. I'll have that, prepared as the chef recommends." "Of course, sir," she replied, jotting it down in her small notebook. Jack noticed her hand tremble ever so slightly, not from nerves, but from sheer fatigue. No sooner had Amelia turned away than two sharply dressed middle-aged men at the next table waved her over. Jack watched, a knot of concern tightening in his chest. As she approached, one man spoke up immediately, his tone curt. "Hey, girl, send someone else to our table, please." "Is there a problem, sir?" Amelia asked politely, her voice still gentle. But Jack heard the tension creeping in. The second man sneered, his arrogance unmistakable. "Nothing serious. We just prefer someone easier to talk to." His words were thinly veiled but pointed. Amelia paused for a heartbeat, her face flushing, a flash of hurt in her eyes she couldn't hide. Then, swallowing hard, she bowed her head and said quietly, "I'll have a colleague assist you right away, sir." Jack clenched his fist under the table, anger rising. He'd never imagined one of his own employees enduring such blatant contempt. Soon he saw Amelia quietly return to Brandon. The manager frowned, irritation plain on his face. "Another customer complaint? Why does it always happen with you, Amelia? Are you not paying attention?" "No, Mr. Evans," she replied, softly but firmly. "They just requested a different server." Brandon sighed heavily, full of reproach. "Fine, I'll send Jessica over. Amelia, remember your place and avoid causing more trouble. I won't repeat myself." Amelia bowed her head and said nothing more. Jack could see tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. His heart felt as if it were being squeezed. He could scarcely believe this was happening in the very restaurant he'd built with such pride. A few minutes later, Amelia reappeared at his table, putting down his water and avoiding direct eye contact. "Sorry for the wait, sir. Your meal will be out shortly." "That's all right," Jack answered gently, looking into her weary, wounded eyes. He couldn't hold back. "Are you okay?" Amelia started, looking at him in surprise, as if unsure she'd heard right. Then she offered him a small, fragile smile. "I'm fine. Thank you for asking. Just another day at work, sir." Jack remained silent, but he'd made his decision. He had to get to the bottom of this. He could not tolerate such callous injustice in his restaurants. As Amelia walked away, Jack watched her slight form and realized he'd overlooked a crucial aspect of his business for far too long. The dignity and respect owed to the very people who made his success possible. Tonight, Brooks Steakhouse still buzzed with glamorous guests under its warm golden lights, as if nothing were amiss. But Jack saw the deep cracks and hidden wounds beneath the perfect veneer he'd so carefully crafted. Most of all, he saw the pained, hurt eyes of Amelia, a young black server, who'd reminded him that the greatest issue wasn't the food quality or the bottom line, but the simple respect for human beings he'd all but forgotten. Jack continued to quietly take in the atmosphere of the restaurant as Amelia swiftly delivered his dinner. Looking down at the perfectly cooked steak on his plate, Jack felt no excitement. Instead, his heart grew heavy with the images he'd just witnessed. The sight of an employee swallowing her pain and injustice just to keep her job in this so-called perfect place. From his seat, Jack had a clear view of the kitchen door, where staff bustled back and forth like gears in an unceasing machine. The tension was palpable in every face, every hurried step, every furtive glance at the wall clock. Jack watched closely as Amelia emerged again from the swinging kitchen door. He immediately noticed fresh burn marks on her hands, red and tender, evidence that she'd been handling hot dishes without time to protect herself. Despite her professional smile, Jack could see the utter exhaustion in her eyes. Carefully, Amelia set a small basket of bread beside his steak and said softly, "Sir, if you need anything else, please let me know." Jack looked into her eyes, hoping to send a wordless message of compassion. But Amelia, accustomed to avoiding direct eye contact, quickly bowed her head and hurried back toward the kitchen as if fleeing some invisible threat. Just then, a sharp, impatient voice called from behind Jack, making him turn in his seat. "Amelia, where do you think you're going? Do you think we pay you to take strolls? Table 7's food is still waiting." The speaker was a middle-aged woman whose name tag read Margaret Wilkins, the supervisor in charge of the servers. With her tightly pinned blonde hair and stern expression, Margaret looked every bit the no-nonsense manager Jack had heard about, but never imagined seeing her treat Amelia so harshly and disrespectfully. "I'm sorry, Miss Wilkins," Amelia replied quietly, trying to explain. "I just finished with table 12. I'll get right on it." Margaret cut her off, her voice rising just enough for nearby staff and a few guests to hear clearly. "You always have an excuse. Why can't you ever do your job as well as everyone else? I can't believe we even hire people like you here." Jack's hand tightened around his fork so violently his palm ached. Margaret's words carried an unmistakable racial slur beneath the surface. This wasn't mere work criticism. It was outright prejudice. A heavy silence fell. A few diners glanced Amelia's way, as if she were the cause of all the commotion. Amelia stood frozen, her hands trembling so slightly but visibly, unable to mask her shame and hurt. Jack realized he was witnessing the cruel underbelly he'd unwittingly allowed to fester, a toxic culture hidden beneath the luxury of his restaurant chain. Every cutting remark, every cold glance from management chipped away at the dignity of employees like Amelia. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," Amelia murmured, striving to remain composed. "I'll do better." Margaret shook her head in disgust and spoke even louder. "If you don't improve right away, you know exactly what will happen, and I don't want to have to repeat myself a second time." Jack felt as though his heart was breaking as he watched Amelia turn away. Her face bowed to hide tears she fought to hold back. He could see her fighting to cling to the last shreds of composure under the stares of judgment around her. In that moment, Jack understood he had utterly failed to create a truly supportive workplace for his staff. Beneath the polished veneer of elegance lay a bitter reality: inhumane pressure, demeaning tirades, and blatant racism. Things he never imagined existed at Brooks' Steakhouse. He sat there, unable to eat another bite of his steak. Everything before him felt dull and tasteless. Across the dining room, he saw other servers keep their heads down and work faster, driven by a constant fear of being the next target. Jack wondered when he had allowed this to happen on his watch, when he let cruelty and injustice become normalized in the business he'd always touted as perfect. He knew now this was no minor issue to sweep under the rug. It was a serious moral crisis, a disease infecting the system that threatened to destroy the very values and reputation he'd spent his life building. As Amelia's small figure disappeared through the kitchen door, Jack made a decision. He had to act immediately. This harsh truth could no longer remain hidden, and he would be the one to end it, no matter the cost. Jack sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the kitchen door where Amelia had just disappeared. The din of laughter and conversation from the surrounding diners suddenly felt distant and unreal. For the first time in his career, he felt completely powerless before the events unfolding in the very restaurant he had built. A few minutes later, Amelia reappeared carrying a tray of food. Her steps were still hurried, but this time Jack could see her struggling to remain composed. Pretending to stare at his phone, he in fact focused every sense on her movements. Amelia gently set the steak on the table, her practiced professional smile in place despite the tension and fatigue he could clearly see etched in her features. Just as she turned to leave, Jack noticed her hesitate. Her hand lingered at the plate's edge a moment longer than usual. His heart suddenly raced, intuition telling him something was different. "Enjoy your meal," Amelia said softly, her eyes flicking toward the manager's station where Margaret stood, scrutinizing every staff member's action. The moment she stepped away, Jack discreetly lifted the corner of the napkin beside his plate. Beneath it lay a neatly folded slip of paper, placed just so he would notice it without anyone else suspecting. Jack's heart pounded. He realized at once that Amelia knew who he was, or at least that he wasn't an ordinary guest. A surge of anxiety mixed with intense curiosity washed over him. He glanced around to ensure no one was watching, then carefully unfolded the note under the table. In hurried but legible handwriting, the message read, "Dear Mr. Reynolds, I know who you are. I recognized you the moment you stepped into the restaurant tonight. I write this in desperation and in hope that you will not ignore what's happening here. Your restaurant is beautiful and your food is delicious, but we are slowly dying inside. Every day here is a terrible ordeal. We're forced to work 12 to 14 hours straight, with no breaks and nothing more than a few bite-sized sandwiches eaten hurriedly in the kitchen. Worse still is what I face daily because of my skin color. I endure insults from customers, colleagues, even from management. They label me slow and incompetent simply because I'm black. I try my hardest, but no matter what I do, it's never good enough. I fear losing my job. This meager paycheck is all I have to support myself and my seriously ill mother at home. I'm not alone. Many others suffer in silence because they're too afraid to speak up. I believe you are a good man, or I wouldn't risk doing this. Please don't let us continue to endure this injustice. Help us, Amelia. Jack felt his breath catch. Those words chilled him to the bone. Never in his business life had he imagined facing such a horrifying reality, especially one born of his own creation. He looked around again, his calm facade gone, replaced by genuine concern. The staff surrounding him, those small figures working in silence and fear, were no longer just names on a payroll. They were victims trapped in an unfeeling, inhumane machine he had started and kept running. Jack folded the note carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, his heart still pounding. Amelia's action was an act of immense courage, but also of desperate need. He realized she had not written this plea for herself alone, but as the voice for dozens, perhaps hundreds, suffering in silence throughout the Brooks Steakhouse chain. When Amelia returned to ask if he needed anything else, Jack met her eyes. In that moment, he saw not only her pain and exhaustion, but also a fragile hope that the most powerful man there would not turn away from her earnest cry for help. "I'm okay, thank you," Jack said softly, his tone conveying that he had received her message and would not ignore it. Amelia tilted her head slightly in acknowledgement, then quietly left his table to return to her demanding shift. Alone again before his now cold meal, Jack knew that from this moment on he could never go back to his old life. The small note Amelia had given him had opened a door to harsh, heartbreaking truths he had never imagined confronting. Jack understood he faced a choice: remain silent and pretend ignorance, or stand up and right the wrongs he had caused. Deep in his heart, he already knew his answer. Jack sat in silence, his eyes staring absent-mindedly at the steak that had long since gone cold. Amelia's shaky, desperate words echoed in his mind like cries for help he had unwittingly ignored for far too long. He clenched his fists beneath the table, fighting to steady the tremor that threatened to rise in his hands. Jack Reynolds' entire life had been devoted to building the Brooks Steakhouse brand, a symbol of culinary perfection and refinement. He'd always taken immense pride in that achievement. But now, Amelia's small note had shattered every mask he'd ever worn. For the first time in his career, he painfully understood that he hadn't created merely a high-end restaurant, but an invisible prison that trapped his staff in fear and despair. He looked around the dining room. The decor remained elegant. The well-heeled diners still chatted away. Yet Jack no longer saw that perfection. All he saw were weary eyes, hurried footsteps, forced smiles, people sacrificing their health, dignity, and joy to uphold the restaurant's polished facade. He spotted Maria, the older black woman who had been with Brooks since the very beginning. Her hollowed eyes spoke of exhaustion. Her calloused hands were raw from endless plate, scrubbing. He'd always known her to be kind and dedicated, but never asked himself how she felt after 14-hour shifts. Across the room, he noticed Carlos, a young Latino server darting between tables, his wrist wrapped in a flimsy white bandage. Jack recalled Amelia's letter. They didn't dare take time off, fearing lost wages, lest they be unable to afford medical care. A deep pang struck Jack, as if he himself were bearing the pain his employees suffered each day. He turned his gaze to Margaret Wilkins, the mid-level manager, watching every move with an austere, unfeeling expression. For the first time, Jack saw Margaret not as an efficient overseer, but as a chilling symbol of the cruelty and prejudice she so readily displayed. He wondered, was Margaret an isolated case? Or had he unknowingly fostered a culture of callousness across his entire chain? He remembered policies he'd championed years ago, strict productivity quotas and rigid performance metrics. At the time, he believed they would drive his restaurants to new heights of professionalism. Now, he realized those rules had become iron shackles, weighing down the very people who worked so hard every day. He could still see Amelia's words. Every day here is a terrible ordeal. He understood that her ordeal wasn't just the physical demands, but the constant fear of rebuke, the threat of dismissal, and the unspoken discrimination she and her colleagues endured in silence. Anger boiled within Jack, but he knew the person he needed to be angry with most was himself. He had created, and then turned a blind eye to, this toxic environment. His indifference and ignorance had exacted a terrible toll, driving dedicated people like Amelia into despair. He looked once more at the note in his hand, folded it, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. His decision was made. Success and profit no longer mattered. They paled in comparison to restoring justice and dignity to the very people who had built this brand from the ground up. With a heavy sigh, Jack pushed the untouched steak away. The meal held no flavor for him now. Every bite seemed to carry the silent reproach of his staff. He felt suffocated and needed air and clarity. Rising from his chair, Jack weaved past unsuspecting diners basking in carefree enjoyment, unaware that beneath the warm glow and attentive service lay countless tears and hidden suffering. He stepped out of the restaurant into the crisp Chicago night. The cold air enveloped him, but all he felt was the relentless ache of regret. He stood there for a long moment, gazing up at the vast night sky, knowing there was no turning back. Jack stood rooted in the cold Chicago night air, his breath forming a thin cloud before him. He glanced at his watch, just before 11. The restaurant's lights still glowed brightly ahead, but Jack headed around to the back alley, the narrow, shadowy corridor where Amelia had asked to meet him. The alley behind Brooks Steakhouse was the exact opposite of its glamorous facade. The scent of rotting food mixed with damp brick, overflowing dumpsters, and rainwater puddles left by an earlier shower made the atmosphere even more bleak. Standing in that darkness, Jack felt as though he'd stepped into an entirely different world, one he'd long chosen to ignore. At exactly 11, the restaurant's back door creaked open and a small figure appeared. Amelia stepped into the alley, her eyes darting anxiously. Spotting Jack waiting in the gloom, she paused, drew a steadying breath, and approached. "Good evening, Mr. Reynolds," Amelia whispered, still clearly uneasy. She forced herself to look him in the eye, her gaze a mix of determination and fear. "Amelia," Jack replied softly, "thank you for having the courage to send me that letter. I want to hear the truth. All of it." Amelia was silent for a moment, her eyes glinting in the weak streetlight as she weighed whether she could place her trust in this powerful man. Finally, she exhaled and began. "Sir, what I wrote in that letter is only a fraction of what goes on every day at your restaurant. We work under brutal pressure, and we endure racism that no one dares to call out." Jack felt a lump in his throat but waited patiently for her to continue. "I started here 2 years ago, and was thrilled to join such a prestigious place. But within weeks, I realized it wasn't what I imagined. Some white customers refused to be served by me, demanding someone else, and management never defended me. In fact, they tacitly agreed." Jack frowned, his expression darkening. But Amelia pressed on. "You've met Margaret Wilkins, right? I know she's trusted for her strictness and efficiency, but in reality she's not only harsh, She's openly discriminatory toward people of color. She always assumes we're slow and incompetent because of our skin. A minor mistake becomes proof of our inadequacy." Jack's heart ached hearing this, not only because he sensed Amelia's genuine despair, but because he knew his own neglect and indifference had allowed this toxic culture to flourish. Amelia drew a deep breath, fighting back tears as she spoke on. "There was one time a customer used outright slurs. When I reported it, Brandon told me I was too sensitive. The customer is always right. It felt like a knife to my self-esteem. My white colleagues got defended, while we had to grit our teeth and endure it, all for fear of losing our jobs." Her voice trembled, but she steadied herself and continued resolutely. "I've thought about quitting, but I can't. I need the money to pay for my mother's treatment. And even if I moved elsewhere, I might still face the same issues. The problem isn't just this restaurant. It's an attitude ingrained in too many." Jack sighed deeply, each word stabbing at his heart. He looked into Amelia's bright eyes and spoke in a low, earnest tone. "Amelia, I am truly sorry. This is entirely my responsibility. I should have seen it sooner." Amelia gave a small nod, though her eyes still held doubt and hurt. She asked softly, caution in her voice, "What will you do now, Mr. Reynolds? Will you actually make changes? Or is this just a conversation to ease your conscience before everything goes back to the way it was?" Her question stopped Jack in his tracks. He knew this was the moment to make a firm promise, no empty words. "I swear to you, Amelia," Jack said firmly, his eyes shining with resolve. "From this moment on, I will not look the other way. I will investigate and root out every problem. No one, manager or customer, may treat you or any employee here with disrespect. You have my word." Amelia searched Jack's eyes for sincerity and at last offered a small, tentative nod. "I'm placing my trust in you, Mr. Reynolds, not just for me, but for all of my colleagues who live in fear every day." In that moment, Jack felt an immense weight settle on his shoulders, but he also knew he had to bear it. Tonight's conversation was more than just a CEO hearing an employee's plea. It was a vow, a commitment to uproot the injustices that had silently prevailed for far too long. Jack and Amelia stood in the alley's darkness, but from that instant on, both understood that this was the turning point. An irreversible change that would determine the future for everyone once forgotten in that perfect restaurant. In the enveloping silence of the dark alley, Jack remained standing, his eyes fixed on Amelia as if trying to fully grasp all she had endured. The narrow space felt thick with the weight of her words, yet Jack knew this was not the whole story. He gently asked, his voice almost a plea, "Amelia, besides you, is there anyone else? Others who are suffering the same way?" Amelia inhaled deeply, her sad gaze dropping to the ground as she weighed whether sharing more might put her and her coworkers in greater danger. Then, with determined eyes, she looked back at Jack and began, "There are many who are suffering, Mr. Reynolds. Let me tell you about Maria first. Maria Gonzalez is an immigrant from Mexico, a single mother raising 3 young children. She works incredibly hard, often twice as many hours as the rest of us, just to earn extra money to support her family." Amelia paused, her voice choking slightly. "But the problem is that Maria is constantly treated unfairly. Margaret scrutinizes her every move, hinting that Maria doesn't belong here, that she's just an immigrant who can't understand the standards of a high-end restaurant. Maria has never been praised or promoted, even though she's one of the most hardworking, dedicated employees. She's even been refused service by certain customers who say they want someone easier to talk to. a reason we all know masks their true prejudice. Jack's brow furrowed and his fist clenched as anger rose within him at the cruel truths he'd never known. Seeing Jack's emotion, Amelia continued, her voice trembling. Then there's Carlos Rivera. You may have seen him. Carlos is a young Latino server who's always cheerful and friendly with guests, but right now he's suffering from a severe wrist injury. He was hurt weeks ago, but hasn't dared to take time off for fear of losing income or being reprimanded by Margaret. Every day he pushes through the pain, something I can see on his face whenever he carries those heavy trays. Jack felt his heart tighten as he recalled seeing Carlos hastily moving through the dining room with that flimsy bandage on his wrist. Amelia's account made him realize how blind he'd been to the suffering happening right under his nose. Amelia's voice grew more emotional as she spoke about herself. As for me, Mr. Reynolds, I don't know where to begin. I've always been proud of who I am and worked hard to show that my skin color does not define me. But every day here is a battle against prejudice and cutting remarks. Guests sometimes make hurtful comments about my race, and management has never defended or protected me. Sometimes they even silently condone the customers' attitudes. She paused, drawing a shuddering breath to hold back tears. One night, a wealthy customer called me unworthy to serve him. I reported it to Brandon, but he just sighed and told me to toughen up, saying that stuff like that is normal in service. My white colleagues have never faced such treatment, but for Maria and me, it's become an accepted reality we're forced to endure. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, overcome with pain and remorse. Amelia's words made him see that his devoted staff, the very people who helped build his restaurant's success, were being reduced to unfeeling cogs in the profit-driven machine he had unwittingly created. Amelia looked at Jack, her eyes full of hope, but still wary, as if waiting for more than just sympathy. Jack understood. He met her gaze, his tone sincere and resolved. I have no excuse, Amelia. What you've told me is heartbreaking, and I am deeply ashamed. But I promise you I will not let this continue. I will investigate thoroughly and speak directly with Maria, Carlos, and the others. I will address this problem at its roots, even if it means confronting my entire management team and the restaurant's clientele. Amelia gave a small nod, a genuine spark of hope finally shining in her eyes. In that moment, Jack realized that his words were not just a promise, but a firm commitment to the difficult fight ahead. A fight to restore justice and dignity to those who had suffered in silence for far too long. In the darkness of the alley, Jack knew that from this moment on, he had no choice but to change things, radically, profoundly, and despite the pain, because it was the right thing to do. After Jack's final words hung in the air, a profound silence settled over them. Amelia remained standing, her gaze locked on his, as if probing for the sincerity and resolve behind his promise. Jack understood that his vow alone couldn't erase the doubts and pain she'd endured for so long, but he was prepared to face that, ready to do whatever it took to earn back her trust and that of the rest of the staff. At that moment, a question that had been gnawing at him burst out, full of genuine concern. Amelia, if things were really that bad, why didn't you just leave? Amelia fell silent, as though his words had struck the very core of her being, the place she'd kept hidden for so long. Her usually fierce eyes shimmered, and tears she'd held back finally spilled down her cheeks. Mr. Reynolds, she choked, her voice trembling, do you think I never wanted to quit? I'm not here because I love this place. I'm here because I have no choice. I need the money, not just to get by, but to chase my greatest dream, studying nursing and becoming a nurse so I can care for others. Jack stood frozen, his heart tightening at the raw, profound despair in her tone. She continued, voice shaking, yet determined. Every time I try to save enough for a course, something happens. My mom gets sick, rent goes up, hospital bills skyrocket, and I have to return to this job, picking up extra shifts, enduring insults and looks of prejudice. I'm trapped in a vicious cycle with no way out. For the first time, Jack truly saw Amelia, not just as an employee, but as a person with her own dreams and struggles, fighting every day merely to survive within a system he'd unknowingly created. He spoke slowly, with deep responsibility. "Amelia, tell me, what do I need to do to make things right?" She lifted her head, hope flared in her eyes, tears still glistening on her lashes. No longer looking away, she laid out her demands clearly. "First, Mr. Reynolds, raise our wages. We deserve fair pay for our effort and sacrifice. No one should work 12 to 14 hours a day and still not cover their basic needs. Maria needs enough to care for her 3 young children, and Carlos needs medical treatment without fearing income loss. Second, reduce our hours. We need time to rest and recharge, both physically and mentally. Nobody performs at their best under constant pressure, exhaustion, and stress. Reasonable hours will make us far more effective. Most importantly, institute an immediate policy protecting employees from racial discrimination. No one here should endure insults or injustice because of their skin color or background. Managers like Margaret and Brandon can't keep turning a blind eye. We need a clear, fair system so we feel safe at work. And finally, implement mandatory anti-discrimination training for all staff and management. Everyone must understand that racism is unacceptable under any circumstances. Jack nodded firmly, grasping the urgency and gravity of her words. He felt both ashamed for letting things reach this point, and deeply admiring of her courage and clarity. Looking straight into her eyes, he vowed, "I promise you, Amelia, I will personally ensure every one of these changes happens. I can't undo the past, but I will change the future. That is my commitment, not just to you, but to every person in this restaurant." Amelia regarded him for a moment, then offered a small, hopeful smile. Tears still wet on her cheeks, but now tears of faith. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," she whispered. "We believe you can do it." In that instant, Jack knew these words could not remain mere promises. He had accepted a challenge from Amelia and from his own conscience that would transform the future of the restaurant, his own future, and above all, the future of those counting on him. The next morning, the large boardroom on the top floor of the Brooks Steakhouse office building was unusually tense. The familiar faces of the executive team were all present, ready for their regular meeting, one that typically focused on profits, expansion plans, and new marketing campaigns. But today, Jack entered with a markedly different expression, more serious and resolute than ever before. Jack slowly set down the thick binders of documents he'd stayed up all night preparing, then looked each director squarely in the eye. His voice carried weight. "Today, we're not talking about profits or marketing strategies. Today, I want to talk about the most important thing we've long forgotten, the people who run this restaurant every day." Silence fell. Before anyone could object, Jack continued without pause. "Last night I spoke directly with an employee named Amelia, a young woman who is dedicated and outstanding at her job. What she told me shocked and deeply disappointed me. We are running a workplace under brutal pressure, with unfair treatment, and worst of all, blatant acts of racism." Murmurs rippled through the room until Peter Hamilton, the oldest and most conservative board member, snapped, "Jack, I'm sorry, but you're being too sensitive. We run a luxury restaurant chain, not a charity. Paying higher wages or reducing hours will destroy our cost structure and seriously impact our profits." Several others nodded in agreement, their faces skeptical and annoyed. Evelyn Thompson, another director, spoke up sharply. "Exactly. I don't think we should base such a major decision on the story of just one or two employees. Our brand is built on quality and efficiency. If staff are unhappy, they're free to work elsewhere." Jack shook his head firmly, his tone sharper than ever. "No, Evelyn. We can no longer treat our people like interchangeable parts. Do you know what our turnover rate is across the chain? It's 78%. Every year, we lose millions recruiting and training new staff, and the main reason they leave is the harsh working conditions and wages that aren't enough to live on." He slammed the prepared documents onto the table, drawing stunned looks from his colleagues. "These are the hard numbers I've gathered. Our internal survey shows over 60% of our employees work an average of 14-hour days without enough pay to cover basic living expenses. More than 50% report having faced discrimination based on race or background, but none dare speak up for fear of losing their jobs. Do you really think that's how we should uphold our brand?" The room immediately fell silent, board members exchanging uneasy glances, but Peter Hamilton still resisted. "Jack, I understand your good intentions, but a change like this will unsettle shareholders and customers. We'll lose our reputation for swift professional service. We can't gamble with that." Unfazed, Jack locked eyes with Peter and spoke each word clearly. "Peter, you're confusing professionalism with inhumanity. Professionalism never meant exploiting our staff. It never meant tolerating racism or injustice. Those are the things that will destroy our reputation from the inside out if we don't address them immediately." He drew a slow breath, his voice both persuasive and powerful. "If we truly want sustainable growth, we must ensure our employees feel respected and safe at work. Think about the long-term benefits. When we raise wages, reduce hours, and improve working conditions, our staff will be more loyal and more productive. When we eradicate racism entirely, our workplace will be healthier and our brand stronger." He continued, emotion beneath every word, but delivery crisp and assured. "I am willing to sacrifice short-term profits if it means building a corporate culture that is sustainable and just. No company endures without the satisfaction and dedication of its employees." Jack's declaration hung in the air, rendering the room eerily still. Some members still looked unhappy, but there was no denying the truth in his words. Finally, Jack concluded with a challenging yet responsible statement. "I understand your concerns about profits and shareholders, but remember, our greatest asset is not our restaurants, menus, or brand. It's our people. If you cannot stand with me on this, then I will move forward on my own. I will implement these changes at our Chicago location as a pilot to prove that a humane management approach is not only possible, but can be our greatest competitive advantage." Jack straightened in his chair, eyes unyielding, standing up to his closest colleagues for the first time in his career. The tension in the boardroom was palpable, but Jack knew he had done the right thing, not just for Amelia and the other employees, but for his own conscience and principles. From this moment on, there was no turning back, only the road ahead to a fairer, more humane future. The heavy tension in the boardroom slowly gave way to a reluctant silence. The directors exchanged wary glances. No one wanted to be the first to admit that Jack might be right. After a long moment of deliberation, Peter Hamilton exhaled and broke the quiet. "All right, Jack, you've made a strong case, but we're still taking a cautious approach. Let's pilot your plan at the Chicago restaurant first. If it works, we'll consider rolling it out more broadly." Jack nodded, knowing this was a small but vital victory. Big changes always begin with modest first steps. That very day, Jack returned to the Chicago location with an entirely new mindset. Not undercover CEO, but a true leader determined to address the long-standing issues. The first thing he did was call all the staff together in a special meeting right in the main dining room. When everyone gathered, Jack stood before them, his expression both stern and sincere. "I want to offer my heartfelt apology to all of you. Until now, I've overlooked what matters most: your safety, your happiness, and your dignity, even though you are the ones who make this restaurant successful every single day." The staff looked at him with a mix of surprise and skepticism. Some were visibly moved, while most held back their trust. Jack understood this, so he quickly outlined the concrete reforms. Starting next week, everyone's base wage will be raised fairly and appropriately. No one here will work more than an 8-hour shift unless you choose to, and any overtime will be paid at full overtime rates. I want you to have the time you need to care for yourselves, your families, and pursue your own goals. He continued, his voice firmer as he addressed the most serious issue. As for racism and unfair treatment, effective immediately, any discriminatory words, actions, or attitudes will be met with strict consequences. We will launch mandatory anti-racism training for all staff and management. I will personally oversee this to ensure that everyone feels safe and respected at work. Whispers rippled through the room, but Jack saw their expressions gradually soften. Maria offered a gentle, emotional smile. Carlos stood quietly, his wrist still bandaged, but relief shone in his eyes. And behind them all, Amelia stood silently, her eyes bright with new hope. Jack then locked eyes with Amelia and made a clear announcement to everyone. "I've decided to appoint Amelia as our new People and Culture Manager here in Chicago. She will be directly responsible for overseeing these reforms and ensuring they're carried out fully and effectively." The room fell into astonished silence, then broke into growing applause. Amelia stood stunned for a moment, tears of surprise and gratitude in her eyes as she realized Jack had placed great trust in her. But from day one of the new measures, Jack and Amelia quickly discovered the real challenges lay ahead. Not everyone was ready for change. Margaret Wilkins immediately voiced her fierce opposition in a manager's meeting. "I can't believe this, Mr. Reynolds," Margaret shouted. "You're turning this place into a charity. We'll lose customers, profits will drop, and you'll regret these thoughtless decisions." Jack held Margaret's gaze, unwavering. "I'm sorry, Margaret, but if you can't adapt to a culture that respects people, this place may no longer be for you. I will never trade employees' well-being and fairness for short-term profit." Enraged, Margaret stormed out, the door slamming behind her, a clear sign the toughest battles were just beginning. In the days that followed, some longtime patrons grumbled about slightly slower service now that staff weren't overworked. A few even demanded the old, faster pace, showing little concern for employees' well-being. This time, however, Amelia, in her new role, stood up for her colleagues. Calmly but firmly, she explained the changes to those guests, emphasizing that true service quality lies not just in speed, but in caring, professionalism, and a team that feels respected and supported. Day by day, those small changes began to shift the staff's attitude. They felt heard and safe. For the first time, they came to work not in fear or anxiety, but with pride and confidence. Jack knew this was merely the beginning. He also knew these reforms wouldn't be easy, and that many challenges still lay ahead. But he was ready to face them, because he now understood that true success isn't measured by profit alone, but by creating a humane workplace where people are valued and empowered to be their best. For Jack, this was the most important and right challenge of his life. The changes at the Chicago restaurant unfolded more quickly and forcefully than Jack ever anticipated. Within just a few weeks of rolling out the new policies, the atmosphere had noticeably improved. Employees were happier and more confident than Jack had ever seen them. Amelia had clearly demonstrated her leadership skills by implementing the reforms he'd entrusted to her, and by shielding the staff from any hint of prejudice or unfairness. But just as the internal culture was shifting positively, Jack began to notice an undercurrent of opposition rising from the outside. A segment of long-time patrons, especially wealthy, influential customers, had caught wind of the changes and dismissed them as over-the-top and totally unnecessary. One afternoon, Jack received word from Amelia that a regular customer, Jonathan Prescott, a powerful Chicago businessman, was loudly denouncing the new policies in front of other diners and threatening never to return. Jack hurried to the restaurant. As he stepped into the main dining room, he froze. Jonathan Prescott stood in the center of the floor, his voice ringing with fury. "I can't believe what this place has become. I pay for fast professional service, not to sit through your cheap moralizing or wait any longer because you want to play heroes." Amelia faced him calmly but firmly. "Mr. Prescott, we remain committed to providing the best possible service. We simply want to ensure our staff work in better conditions. I hope you understand." Prescott sneered, his tone growing harsher. "I don't care about your personal issues. If you keep up these ridiculous changes, I'll make sure none of my friends ever set foot in here again. We'll boycott this place." His threat sent a hush over both staff and guests. At that moment, Jack stepped forward, standing beside Amelia, his expression resolute but composed. "Mr. Prescott, I'm sorry you're unhappy, but let me be clear. These changes are necessary, and we will not reverse course because of a few empty threats." Prescott spun around, surprise flashing alongside his anger. "Jack, you're making a huge mistake. Are you really going to sacrifice your reputation and profits just to protect a bunch of employees?" Jack looked Prescott squarely in the eye. "I don't see it as a sacrifice, Mr. Prescott. I'm doing what's right and needed. If customers only come here to feel special or to look down on others, then perhaps we're not the right restaurant for them." Prescott fell silent, rage simmering in his eyes but unable to counter Jack's firm words. After a moment, he turned and stormed out, leaving a tense hush behind him. News of the confrontation spread quickly, sparking mixed reactions in the local media. Some outlets praised Jack as a bold CEO challenging outdated values. Others accused him of losing the brand's identity and sabotaging his reputation for idealistic nonsense. Jack realized he stood at the most critical crossroads of his career. The easiest path would be to revert to the old ways, stabilize profits, appease traditional customers, and return to a false sense of calm. But doing so would betray the trust Amelia and his staff had placed in him. That afternoon, Jack convened an urgent all-staff meeting with Amelia. Facing everyone, he spoke candidly. "I know these reforms have stirred controversy and pressure, but I want you to know I will not back down. I believe in the new values we're building, a place where every employee is respected, protected, and treated fairly. We cannot go back to the old path because that path led to injustice and suffering." His words left the room in moving silence. Amelia was the first to speak, her voice firm with emotion. "I believe in you, Mr. Reynolds. All of us do." One by one, employees rose to their feet and nodded in agreement. Maria, her eyes shining, added, "I've worked here for years, and this is the first time I've ever felt truly valued. We will stand with you, no matter what. Looking at the faces of the people he knew so well, faces alight with trust and hope, Jack realized more clearly than ever that defending these new policies was the best decision he had ever made. Though he knew the road ahead would be stormy, Jack was ready to face and overcome every negative reaction from the public or customers. He understood that to achieve real, lasting change, he must remain courageous and steadfast. And above all, he knew that the genuine support of his team was the strongest foundation for the business's future success. Jack drew in a deep breath, more determined than ever. This was no longer just a battle for reputation or profit. It was a fight for human dignity, for justice, and for a fairer future for everyone. The early days of this change campaign were undeniably tough, but as Jack's determination and the staff's trust began to yield real results, the atmosphere at Brooks Steakhouse shifted noticeably for the better. The criticism and boycott threats from that small group of customers gradually withered away in the face of strong public and community support. What surprised Jack most was that the impact of these reforms extended far beyond the restaurant's walls. A few months in, word of mouth spread. New diners came to Brooks Steakhouse, not just for the good food and service, but to support the positive values Jack and his team were building. The data spoke for itself. Jack's bold decision was completely vindicated. Employee turnover plunged from 78% to just 15% within 6 months. Hiring new staff became easier as the restaurant's reputation grew as a model workplace, one where human dignity was truly respected and protected. Amelia blossomed in her new role. With Jack's full support, she quickly established herself as a capable, professional leader. The same young server who had once been overlooked and insulted now stood as an ideal ambassador for Brooks Steakhouse's new, humane values. Staff no longer came to work in fear. They walked in with visible pride and genuine smiles. Carlos finally received proper treatment for his wrist injury and made a full recovery, while Maria, at last, had time to care for her 3 young children, her joy plain to see. As for Margaret Wilkins, the manager who had caused the greatest upheaval, she ultimately chose to resign, realizing she could not adapt to the restaurant's new culture. Even then, in her final meeting with Jack, she conceded, "I may not agree with every change you've made, but I have to admit the restaurant has never been better. Good luck, Jack." One evening, Jack stood quietly in a corner of the dining room, taking in the scene before him, so different from the first time he'd entered Undercover. The laughter of diners, the contented, proud faces of his staff, it moved him deeply. He realized that what he had achieved was the true success he'd always sought. A place where people came before profits, and where self, respect, and dignity were absolutely safeguarded. Amelia joined him, her eyes full of gratitude and deep pride. "Mr. Reynolds, I don't know how to thank you enough. My life, and the lives of my colleagues, has been completely transformed since you decided to stand up for us." Jack turned to her with a gentle smile, filled with a peace and happiness he'd never known before. "No, Amelia, it's I who should thank you and everyone else. You have shown me that the most important thing in business isn't how much money we make, but how we make it. Without you and your courage, I'd still be trapped in illusions of perfection." Amelia's face lit up brighter than ever, and she nodded softly. "I think we've all learned something invaluable these past few months." Jack patted her shoulder, his voice proud and resolute. "And we'll keep spreading these good values, Amelia. I want Brooks Steakhouse to be a shining example, proof that business success and ethical integrity are not mutually exclusive." Within only a few months, the story of Brooks Steakhouse's dramatic, humane turnaround spread widely through the business community and beyond. Other enterprises began seeking out Jack, eager to learn how he had built such a healthy, fair workplace. Journalists and interviewers lauded him as a pioneer reshaping the business mindset, launching a new movement in which people truly come first. Jack no longer fretted over those who had opposed him or threatened to boycott. He knew the path he'd chosen had been challenging, but it was unquestionably leading to a better, more sustainable future. Formerly angry customers gradually returned, this time not just for the cuisine, but out of respect and admiration for what the restaurant now stood for. A year after that stormy beginning, Brooks Steakhouse received Chicago's prestigious Humanitarian Business Award, honoring its contributions to a healthy, inclusive work environment and its fight against racism. At the awards ceremony, Jack Reynolds stood before the crowd, his eyes brimming with emotion, as he looked toward Amelia and the rest of his staff seated below. "The greatest success I hold today isn't the money in our accounts, nor the profits we've earned. True success is the happiness, dignity, and self-respect of every person who works here, and I promise you, this is only the beginning." Thunderous applause filled the hall. Amelia beamed at Jack with boundless gratitude. In that moment, Jack understood that his bold choice had truly opened a new, meaningful chapter in his life, a new mission and a future he had long wished to build from his heart. Through Jack Reynolds' journey of struggle and resolve, we learn that real success isn't measured by profit alone, but by the dignity and happiness of each individual. A restaurant once flawless on the surface hid deep pain and injustice within, but when a leader dares to confront it, everything can change. What about you? If you were Jack Reynolds, would you dare sacrifice profit to fight for such humane values? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share this meaningful story, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.